This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
When I first saw the title of this event, the paper that we're about to hear, I thought it was a reference to the sailing events in the Olympics. But no, I didn't see the dates at the end. So I did want to just acknowledge the hard work of the organizers of the conference, and I'm very happy that Brazil Institute can be part of the conference. But Lyndon Newson, Leslie, of course, Alan Charlton, and of course Oliver Marshall. Thanks for helping to put this together. Sort of. Nothing? Okay, nothing. Nothing, says Oliver. I'm sure it's not nothing, but... But so this panel on political relations, we can start with Joseph Smith's paper on Britain ruling the waves. Thanks. And I've been instructed to tell you to fill out one of these forms on the... Oh, you've already done it. Okay, thanks.
I haven't brought any stuff for the computer. I'm really old-fashioned. Well, I thought I was coming on second, but start off. Well, anyway, thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's been very, very interesting. Some positive points, I suppose. Leslie referred to old lags yesterday, and I guess we like to have all these anecdotes about the past. Why did I become interested in the Brazilian Naval Revolt of 1893-94? Well, it was because Robin Humphreys, my supervisor, that's the name of the past, said to me that an American author, Walter Lefebvre, had written about British complicity in that revolt. And he said to me, you go down to the PRO and investigate these illusions or these fabrications of this American historian. So that's what I did. And then I gave a seminar at Robin's seminar. And he was very pleased with my publication, or with my presentation, I should say. And he phoned me one day and said, Joe, I've spoken with David Jocelyn at Cambridge, and we'll publish your piece in the Journal of Latin American Studies. Well, I wish things were so easy as that now. In doing research or in writing up the paper, I went to a reception at the Brazilian embassy, and the ambassador, Pereira Costa, very kindly said I could borrow his book, O Diplomacia do Marechal. And that was very kind and really showed what a fine man he was. And the Brazilians were very pleased with my article, and they gave me the Rio Branco Prize. We had a fantastic lunch. I don't know how many courses, how many glasses of wine, de Casa do Brasil. And so I have very positive feelings about Brazil. And what I felt was that I wanted to go to the bay, Guanabara Bay, and see just what the place was like. And in a sense, that's what started me along the road to research on Brazil. So again, very positive feelings. And I've included those not just to wallow in the past, but because they serve as an antidote to the destructive vitriol which I'm now going to give to you. Britain rules the waves, but not in Guanabara Bay, 1893-94. Well, it's going to be, as a traditional historian, a lot of quotations. Though they're not Shakespearean ones, but anyway. In 1921, the British councillor at Rio, a man called Henry Chilton, he reported in a private letter, of course, "The Brazilians are past masters in the art of procrastination and prevarication." Fancy words for saying delay. "And no amount of verbal representations or notes and reminders appear to stir them from their lackadaisical and shifty manner of carrying out business. The only thing which might possibly bring them to their senses would be a British fleet in the bay with its guns trained on the town." Well, Chilton's sense of frustration was shared by many diplomats. You can find these very, very nice quotes in the correspondence. Constantine Phipps, 1896. "The Brazilian government are masters in the art of temporization." Then there's a famous description of Rio Branco by William Haggard, the minister in 1907. And he writes about Rio Branco's style of work. Quote, "His slovenliness and untidiness are appalling. His table is covered literally a foot high with documents, in their turn covered with dust. This is probably the dust heap into which disappear many of our carefully prepared private letters and memoranda on pressing matters, and possibly our notes, of which we never hear anything again. His memory is worse than bad. One speaks to him and he forgets all about that, and so on ad infinitum." So that's one comment on Rio Branco. According to Haggard, relations became even worse under Rio Branco's successor, Lauro Miller. Haggard observed, "The difficulties of doing business with the Brazilian government, already great and unusual during the life of Baron do Rio Branco, have increased rather than diminished under his successor. Latterly, they have become almost insurmountable. One never gets any reply to a written representation, and unless one can manage to catch the Minister for Foreign Affairs accidentally, he is practically unapproachable." Well, there you are. Georges Clemenceau, the French president, visited Brazil in 1911. And he wanted to find out what are the diplomats here, what are the local diplomats interested in. Well, what concerned them was, where is Rio Branco? Where is Rio Branco? Is he in Rio or is he in Petropolis? And they found that when they went to Petropolis, he was in Rio. And when they went to Rio, he was in Petropolis. Ernest Hamblock, the British consul, said, well, consuls have no status. Consuls are belittled by Rio Branco. And he said, the trouble is, he was treated so badly in Liverpool, where he was consul for so many years, so he's getting his own back. So that para os ingleses ver. There was the other side. I was saying that you know, that all right, Miller was unapproachable, but Brazilian had a reason for that, and that's something I'm not going into. So. I'll just give you one more of these quotes. Foreign Office clerk R.J. Sperling summed up in 1913. If Brazil did not occupy such a large space on the map, it could scarcely be treated as a civilized country for the purpose of diplomatic relations. Well, I mean, this is value-laden, judgmental, and so on. On a practical level, the question was, or the task was, how could the transaction of diplomatic business be speeded up? Chilton has suggested the use of a naval force, gunboat diplomacy. And that reflected very much the fact that Britain was the world's leading seafaring power. Britain ruled the waves. However, gunboat diplomacy might seem attractive, it might seem alluring, but it was an option very rarely pursued by Britain. Chilton's suggestion of the dispatch of a British fleet to Guanabara Bay with the task of coercing the Brazilian government, it was not practical in terms of the resources, the logistics of sending the fleet to Guanabara Bay. And even so, it wasn't very sensible because it was likely to provoke retaliation. It was likely to unify opposition to foreigners by stimulating nationalism and so on. And as an example of this, I've chosen the Brazilian Naval Revolt, which, as I've said before, was, I didn't say, the start of my publications in 1971. So 45 years ago, it started out. And I think what we see is that British policy in the Naval Revolt was reactive. It was not dominating events, making events. It was reacting to what was happening. It was not aggressive, as really we're talking in terms of gunboat diplomacy. It was defensive. Now, you all know the details of the Brazilian Naval Revolt, so don't need to go into them today, do I? And anyway, it's talking about 1893-94. Started on the 6th of September, when Admiral Custódio de Mello took command of the Navy, Brazilian Navy, in the harbor of Rio, in Guanabara Bay. He demanded the resignation of Vice President Floriano Peixoto under threat of a naval bombardment of the city. If you don't resign, then I'm going to bomb the city, bombard the city. So what we had was Mello, Custódio Mello, with his fleet, in charge of the fleet, which were basically about 20 ships, 6 protected cruisers, and the big ironclad Aquadabal. The big ironclad, they were under his control. He was in command of the sea, of the bay, and Floriano was in command of the batteries, the artillery on shore. Now, Custódio Mello expected really a quick victory because he had achieved such a victory 2 years earlier when Deodoro da Fonseca had resigned in the same circumstances, very similar circumstances. But that didn't happen in 1893. What people thought would be a brief political interlude became a prolonged siege that would last until March 1894. Now, how did the Foreign Office respond to this? Well, British policy must be neutral. Neutrality would come first. Must not take sides. I should have said that there were 3 warships, 3 British warships in the bay at the time of the outbreak of the revolt. The British government ruled that they would pursue a policy of strict neutrality and also legality. The law officers of the Crown were consulted. What should we do? What can we do? The law officers of the Crown advised that until Custódio de Mello had put in force a complete blockade, the rebels could not be recognized and given belligerent rights. So the rebels had to have complete control of the bay, that is, control of ingress and egress of ships from the bay. And they should also set up a provisional government. Only when these conditions had been established would Britain grant them recognition and belligerent rights. Why was Britain concerned about events in the harbor? Well, there were no strategic interests at stake here. It was trade, the damage to British trade. That was the problem. It was a bit of a standoff between Custódio and Floriano. Most of the fighting was sort of centered around Custodio's desire to capture Niterói. And so most of the fighting was really between the islands between the bay and Niterói. And there was in fact a landing of the rebels which failed. But ships going in and out were subject to sporadic firing from the forts. And the problem was that most of this firing was totally inaccurate, so nobody knew where the shells or bullets were going. And this, of course, is the worst type of thing for merchants. They want to have safe passage to the harbor where they can load and unload their cargoes. And here was the firing, it was sporadic, they could not anticipate it. What, of course, they wanted was intervention by the foreign fleets, especially the British fleet, which was the biggest in the harbor, at the beginning of the revolt. But the British commander said, well, naval commander, I have informed masters of ships and agents that it is impossible for me to afford protection to ships and lighters, as I will not risk the lives of officers and men. So the British Navy didn't want to sail in and act as a sort of protector of the foreign fleet, because, as Lang said, it was dangerous for his men, his officers and his men. Their lives would put at risk. And also, any intervention, any naval intervention by those British ships would be an unneutral act. They would help one side or the other side. And so Lang, well, he was in a very difficult position. The inability of the British naval commander to provide adequate protection to merchant shipping resulted, of course, in damage and loss to British merchants, and prompted a groundswell of criticism back home in Britain. Letters to the Foreign Office, petitions to the Foreign Office, questions in the House of Commons that were critical of government policy. What is the British Navy doing, this great fleet? What's it doing when we're in such disaster in the harbour? Prime Minister William Gladstone acknowledged in the Commons what he described in Rio as a lamentable state of affairs, which would not change so long as the two contending parties were firing at each other. So this was a lamentable state of affairs. The implication was clear from Gladstone's statement. The Brazilians would determine events for themselves. Britain would be neutral. By choosing to be neutral, Britain was therefore, we might say, helpless. Now, there were also diplomatic constraints on British policy. And here, I think, there hasn't been enough credit given to Floriano Peixoto for the strong position, consistent position, the tough, unyielding attitude that he took at this time. Floriano Peixoto did not resign, did not quietly go away, as Deodoro had done two years earlier. Floriano upset the complacency of the Foreign Office by declaring that the rebels, Custodio de Mello, was a mutineer. They had mutinied. They were criminals. You could not deal with them. He was critical of any dealings between the diplomats or the foreign naval commanders and de Mello. He also spread rumors. Well, he had a very skillful media campaign in which he stated that Britain was aiding the rebels. Britain was secretly aiding the naval rebels. Why? To restore the monarchy. The monarchy had been overthrown just a few years earlier. And the new republic had signed a trade treaty, a reciprocity treaty with the United States, which of course gave preference to certain American goods. So Britain was trying, of course, to reverse the flow of events, to bring back the empire. And Floriano said that the British were supplying the rebels with coal, and that they were on the rebel side. Well, the Brazilian minister in London came running round to the Foreign Office, demanding that Britain state that they had no such policy. The Foreign Office felt that it was placed on the defensive. A public statement was necessary. Gladstone sought to clarify matters by stating in the Commons, this is on the record in the House of Commons in Hansard, "We have no intention and are advised that we have no right to interfere in the quarrel." So he was making a public statement that Britain is not going to interfere in the Brazilian naval revolt. So here we are, despite ruling the waves, despite being the most powerful naval country, the English Navy, the British Navy, the British government found that it had little influence on the shaping of events in Guanabara Bay. Perhaps the one thing where they were successful was in the day after the outbreak of the revolt. The foreign naval commanders and the diplomats had come together, and it's said to Floriano and to de Mello that if they must give a 24 hours notice if they were going to bombard the city, or if they were going to bombard the fleet. So if they were going to take massive artillery measures, they had to give 24 hours notice for evacuation. Now, Custodio de Mello recognized that, and in so doing, he gave up one of his best military tactics, that is, of surprise. Because he was saying, if I choose to bombard the city, I will give you 24 hours notice. Well, I mean, he's throwing away all the importance, the significance of bombarding the city. And in fact, that measure, which the foreign naval commanders and the diplomats felt, well, they had succeeded in for moral humanitarian reasons, they had succeeded, actually was favorable to Floriano and detrimental to Custodio. And that's where you see the point of any sort of intervention would tend to favor Floriano against de Mello. So, just like Henry Chilton's comment and his frustration, British diplomats and senior naval officers were frustrated by events in Brazil. In effect, the Brazilian revolt revealed that Britain, for all its military naval power, was essentially helpless.